90s Japanimation. Where to start? There's such a strong appeal to the 90s anime art style, so much to the point where 3 decades later, it's become a very beloved niche in the medium. You guys have all seen the countless popular pages on social media, and it's even become a niche on YouTube where a lot of us have created audiences for ourselves exclusively talking about shows that fall within a 5 to 10 year range before or after this period. With so many mangaka that carry their own unique styles, so many animation studios with their own unique delivery, what causes us to love this shit so much? First and foremost, the first thing most will say when comparing the golden era to the modern era is that today everything is completely digitalized, whereas pre-2000s everything was done with hand-drawn cels, which is absolutely true and it plays its role. But that's sort of beside the point of this particular topic. See, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s to 80s used hand-drawn animation too, but what I'm breaking down today is why we love the 90s particularly. There is something about the years 1990 to 2000 that was very unique in anime's history timeline, and it is a catalyst for so much nostalgia within the community, not unlike what we see happening in the video game community. But stay right here. We don't have time to go all the way over there. So shall we begin? The short answer for why this period of time became so unique and beloved really has one simple answer. Things tend to have a beginning and they evolve over time. They say 1907 was the true inception of anime, with Katsuro Shashin, which was some little few second animation that was barely even sketch, but it represents the range of art that was able to be done during that time. Then in 1917, the next milestone was Namakura Gatana and Urashima Taro in 1918. A couple shorts only a few minutes long. And those represent what anime art was capable of for that time period, with more solidified sketching now that a decade has passed. Fast forward a couple of decades and it's clear as day the Japanese were trying to nibble off the heels of what the Western artists were doing. In the late 20s, early 30s, wow, it's almost been 100 years since that time, that's crazy. But yeah, Walt Disney started popping off with a series of cartoons like Oswald and the Lucky Rabbit. Around this time, the Japanese were coming out with things like Danamon Ban, the Monster Exterminator, and if you look carefully at these, it's clear as day where the influence came from. This isn't a secret though, it's common knowledge that characters like Betty Boop and Mickey Mouse had a very big influence on the designs of early anime characters. But to make a long story short, over time the Japanese took their influences and experimented some more until one day. It's the 50s and now you have things like The Tale of the White Serpent and Magic Boy. And at this point it's safe to say that this is Japanese animation. This makes a good video in the future, like what eventually separated Japanese animation from Western animation, but for now, this is where we were at in the 1950s. And then the 60s, and then the 70s, the 80s, and then we got to the 90s. Closing off this point, I just say it's an uncalculated coincidence that 90s anime just so happens to be the period that sorta stands out the most based off of different levels of creativity, intuitions, and imaginations of artists at that time. So let's talk a bit about what particularly draws us to 90s anime. See, listen, I figured this out a long time ago, and I always wondered if anyone else kinda looked at it the way that I did. The 90s represents a maximization of limited resources available back at that time. See, there was a crash in the economy back in the late 1980s which affected the economy of the world into the early 90s, which, you guessed it, affected the anime industry. In Japan, this period is literally referred to as the Lost Decade, which is interesting because it even sounds like an anime arc, right? This means that there was only so much money going into production, but it didn't erase the fact that people were still talented. Which is why there are so many anime in the 90s with so much attention to detail on the drawing side, but very poor animation. This is why you'll watch a show like Sailor Moon or Yu Yu Hakusho, or anything from that time really, and you'll admire the backgrounds, the sky, the buildings, the coloring, the nature. But then the actual animation in a technical sense is pretty bad, the fluidity and all of that. And that creates the uniqueness that is 90s anime. You've got a variety of skilled artists limited by a lack of resources. There's your answer. I'm gonna come back and close this point out, but I also wanted to talk about one more reason that we love the 90s so much. Has anyone else caught on to the fact that there's actually 3 different art styles or 3 different styles that existed through the 90s? See, you have the early 90s style, let's say 90 to 92, maybe pushing 93, which comes from a confused time where they weren't quite sure if it was still the 80s or if they were ready to move on to what became the 90s for real. A few good examples of this are Gundam Stardust Memory, where the art style literally could pass for something straight out of 1986, even though it came out around 90 to 91. Another example I noticed was with the original Dragon Quest anime from 91. Really, a lot of this just comes from the clothing or the way the hair is drawn and stuff like that. And of course, I have to note that plenty of shows came out in the 90s, like as far as their anime adaptations, but the manga origins came from the 80s, so it makes a lot of sense. Then you have the mid-90s era, which this is the epitome of what most people are going to think of when they think of 90s anime. If you hear 90s anime, a lot of these shows that you think of come from this particular time period. And I'd say that's around 1994 to 1997. So we're talking about stuff like Rurouni Kenshin, Gundam Wing, Evangelion, Escaflowne, and even Pokemon. This period was a very fantasy-oriented period too. Look at some of the OVAs that came out during this time. And that means crazy backgrounds, crazy environments, crazy settings, outfits, colors, character designs, the way the eyes are shaped, the way the eyes are colored, the big ass eyes, the big ass hair, the big ass, costumes and all this crazy shit, right? And then we have my personal favorite era in anime, period. The late 90s, 1998 and 1999. And you can even put 2000 in there too. But I mean, now we're talking about the 90s style pretty much being perfected in terms of art. Character designs and the backgrounds, colors. I mean, it took everything that the entire 90s up to that point had done and pretty much perfected it. Now, I want you guys to understand, I'm talking specifically on an art level because a lot of these shows, the animation was pretty bad, but I'm specifically talking art style, right? I'm talking the art style, just the aesthetics, okay? Now, this is where we started seeing first taste of a little bit of digital being blended in with the traditional hand-drawn style. And that's, of course, for another video. I just want to put that in there because that's going to be more into the animation aspect. But that did kind of alter the way that they were drawing things too. It still is going to affect the art, you know what I mean, if you get what I'm trying to say. Now, most of these shows, like I said earlier, they were really detailed in designs, but then had weak animation. To bring everything home, man, the 90s art style is beloved because of how unique that time period was, as far as blending together talent, but with a lack of resources. It maximizes potential during a time when the budgets were literally at rock bottom. It also had 3 different variations, the early 90s, mid-90s, and late 90s, and overall it was just an ambitious time. I mean, could it just be nostalgia? Maybe. But tell me what you think. Why do you love 90s anime? Bye.